The satellite feed had gone dark 47 minutes ago. In the operations center at Bagram Airfield, 3 analysts stared at the frozen image of 6 Navy SEALs pinned against a rock face in Kunar province, their thermal signatures fading into the Afghan dusk. The quick reaction force was still 20 minutes out. Apache gunships were rearming after a 4-hour firefight 30 miles south. Every asset in theater was committed, overstretched, or too far away. The ground commander's last transmission had been clipped, professional, resigned. Tell our families we held the line. Then static. The Taliban had spent 3 days maneuvering for this moment, funneling a 12-man SEAL reconnaissance team into a narrow valley where the mountains rose so steep that close air support became a geometrical nightmare. Jet aircraft couldn't dive without smashing into ridgelines. Helicopters couldn't hover without becoming target practice. The insurgents knew exactly what they were doing. They'd studied American doctrine, identified the seams in its armor, and now they were exploiting those seams with patient, methodical violence. In the operations center, a major with 2 combat tour and a Bronze Star turned away from the monitors. He'd written too many letters. He knew how this ended. That's when the radio crackled with a call sign nobody expected to hear. Havoc, Maine, this is Reaper 7-1, inbound from Kandahar with 30 Mike and full rocket pods. I've got your coordinates and I'm 3 minutes out. The controller blinked at his scope. The IFF transponder showed an A-10 Thunderbolt, but 7-1 wasn't scheduled for this sector. The pilot's voice was calm, almost conversational, with a slight Carolina drawl that didn't match the desperation of the situation. Reaper 7-1, Havoc, Maine, be advised that Valley is hot, multiple ZSU positions, RPG teams on high ground, and the weather window is closing. Apache flight aborted their approach due to enemy fire density. How copy? There was a pause just long enough for everyone listening to imagine the pilot absorbing the tactical picture. When she replied, her voice carried something the operations center hadn't heard in hours: certainty. Solid copy, Havoc. I've been in worse. The major turned back to the monitors. He pulled up the aircraft registry. Reaper 7-1, Captain Nick Zabalos, 2,000 hours in the Warthog, 3 combat deployments, Silver Star recipient, and a reputation that made half the officer corps uncomfortable because she had a tendency to arrive uninvited at battles everyone else had written off. The frozen satellite image flickered, then refreshed. The SEALs were still there, still breathing, but for how much longer nobody could say. The A-10 came in low over the ridge at 300 knots, its titanium bathtub cockpit gleaming dull gray against the copper Afghan sky. From the ground, the aircraft looked prehistoric, brutish, all function and no elegance. Its nose was painted with a faded shark mouth that had seen too many sandstorms. The General Electric GAU-8 Avenger cannon protruded from the fuselage like the stinger of some enormous mechanical wasp. Nick Zabalos flew with her visor up, eyes scanning the ridgelines with the kind of focused intensity that came from flying close air support in places where the difference between friendly and enemy was sometimes 15 meters and a radio call. She'd launched from Kandahar the moment she heard the SEAL team's emergency beacon, didn't wait for approval, didn't file a revised flight plan, just spooled up the engines and pointed her jet toward the sound of Americans dying. The controller's warning about the valley being hot was technically accurate but fundamentally useless. Every valley in Kunar was hot. The terrain itself was hostile, a maze of 10,000-foot peaks and narrow defiles where the wind could flip an aircraft into a mountainside without warning. Nix had studied this region for 3 years, memorized its shadows, learned which approaches the Taliban thought were impossible. She'd flown relief missions here when other pilots turned back. She'd put ordnance on targets that fire control computers said couldn't be hit, and she'd done it so many times that the infantry units started requesting her by name, which annoyed the hell out of her squadron commander. He thought she was reckless. He thought she took unnecessary risks. He was half right. She did take risks, but they were never unnecessary. Nix checked her fuel gauge. 4,000 pounds remaining. Enough for maybe 20 minutes of combat maneuvering before she'd have to sprint for the tanker track. Her heads-up display painted the valley in green wireframe geometry. 6 blue icons for the SEAL team, clustered tight against the northern rock wall. 43 red icons for enemy combatants, distributed in a textbook L-shaped ambush with interlocking fields of fire. The Taliban commander down there knew his business. She keyed her radio. Havoc Main, Reaper 7-1 is visual on friendlies, requesting terminal attack control from ground element. A different voice came back, younger, breathless with pain and adrenaline. Reaper, this is Anvil 2-6 actual. We are danger close on all sides, taking heavy fire from reinforced positions at grid November Delta 478123. We've got 2 urgent surgical, 1 routine. Cannot maneuver. Cannot suppress. Need immediate fire support on marked positions or we're done. Nix toggled her targeting pod. The infrared camera zoomed in on the valley floor, rendering the scene in ghostly white-hot clarity. The SEALs had taken cover behind a tumble of boulders that offered concealment but almost no protection. She could see muzzle flashes blooming like flowers along the ridgeline, disciplined 3-round bursts from fighters who'd been trained by someone competent. The Taliban weren't charging. They didn't need to. They were grinding down the Americans with patience and geometry, waiting for ammunition to run out, for medical supplies to fail, for hope to die. Nix ran the calculations in her head. Standard gun run protocols wouldn't work here. The valley was too narrow. If she came in perpendicular to the ridgeline, she'd be exposed to every heavy machine gun and man-portable air defense system in the province. If she came in parallel, she wouldn't have a firing solution without putting 30mm rounds through the SEAL position. The textbook answer was to abort and wait for fast movers with precision-guided munitions. But textbooks didn't account for 6 men bleeding out in the dirt while waiting for a solution that might never arrive. She nosed the A-10 down, trading altitude for speed. Anvil 2-6, Reaper 7-1. I need you to mark your position with IR strobes and get everyone flat. I'm coming in from the southeast, gun run along axis of your position. I'll be walking fire from south to north, 30 meters from your location. Do not move. Do not stand up. Do not do anything heroic. Acknowledge. There was a long pause. Then the SEAL commander's voice came back, steady despite the chaos behind it. Reaper, that's inside our minimum safe distance. You're gonna be threading a needle while people are shooting at you. Nick smiled, cold and thin. Anvil, I've threaded smaller needles with worse odds. Mark your position and trust the process. 3 infrared strobes blinked to life on her targeting screen. The A-10 shuddered as she pushed the throttles forward, diving into the valley at an angle that made her altimeter warning scream. The heads-up display showed her closure rate, dive angle, time to weapons release. 2 miles out. 90 seconds. The first tracer rounds arced up from the ridgeline, lazy orange streaks that seemed slow until you realized they were moving at 2,000 feet per second. Nix jinked left, then right, never quite predictable. The A-10 was built to absorb punishment, redundant systems, and armored everything, but that didn't mean she wanted to test its limits. She armed the GAU-8 cannon. The targeting reticle settled over the southern end of the enemy line. 1 mile out. 45 seconds. More tracers now, a whole constellation of them, crisscrossing the valley like a net designed to trap her. The A-10's radar warning receiver lit up with multiple threats, tracking radars trying to get a lock. But Nix was too low, too fast, screaming through the valley at 100 feet above the deck, where the mountains themselves masked her from anything sophisticated. She could see individual fighters now, crouched behind rocks, aiming up at her with rifles and machine guns. They'd expected jets that stayed high and dropped bombs from safe distances. They hadn't expected a pilot crazy enough to fly directly into their kill zone. Nix squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon roared to life with a sound like the universe tearing itself apart. 65 rounds per second of 30mm depleted uranium hate pouring down onto the ridgeline. The recoil was so fierce it actually slowed the aircraft, shoving her back in her seat as the cannon turned rock and flesh and fighting positions into vapor and debris. She walked the fire north, precisely controlling the burst, watching her rounds impact 30 meters from the SEAL position just like she'd promised. Dust and smoke geysered into the air. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped completely along the southern third of the ambush line. Anvil 2-6 Reaper. Guns, 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 south sector suppressed. How copy? The SEAL commander's response was nearly drowned out by the sound of secondary explosions as ammunition cooked off in the burning positions. Reaper, solid hits, enemy broken contact south sector. We're still taking fire from northeast ridgeline, multiple machine gun positions. Grid November Delta 478155. Nix pulled hard on the stick, hauling the A-10 into a punishing 8G turn that grayed out her vision at the edges. The aircraft clawed for altitude, engines screaming, climbing back above the ridgeline where she could reposition for another attack. Her fuel gauge showed 3,000 pounds remaining. She'd burned through 1,000 pounds in that single gun run. The math was getting tight. She rolled inverted at the top of her climb, looking down through the canopy at the valley below. From up here, she could see the whole tactical picture. The Taliban were repositioning, pulling fighters from the western slope to reinforce the northeast positions. They were adapting, trying to mass their remaining firepower before she could make another pass. Smart, but not smart enough. Nix rolled upright and nosed back down, this time approaching from a different angle, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible second. The enemy machine guns opened up the moment she cleared the ridgeline, tracers converging on her aircraft like spotlights. Something hit her left engine with a metallic bang that echoed through the airframe. The engine fire warning light illuminated, steady and red. Nix scanned the gauges, oil pressure dropping, exhaust gas temperature climbing. The left turbofan was dying, chewing itself apart from whatever had punched through its compressor section. She shut it down, pulled the fire suppression handle, and kept flying. The A-10 was designed for this. It could fly on one engine, take battle damage that would kill any other aircraft, and still bring its pilot home. But that assumed you weren't planning to stick around for another gun run in a valley full of people trying to kill you. Nix armed another rocket pod. Anvil 2-6, Reaper 7-1. I'm taking damage but still mission capable. Marking northeast positions with rockets, then I'll make one more gun pass before I have to egress for fuel. You need to be ready to move the second I suppress those positions. How copy? The SEAL commander's voice was tight with something between gratitude and disbelief. Reaper, you're hit. Say again your status. Nix didn't answer immediately. She was busy lining up the shot, compensating for the asymmetric thrust from her single remaining engine, adjusting for wind and altitude and the dozen other variables that turned rocket attacks from theory into practice. When she finally keyed the mic, her voice was flat, professional, betraying nothing of the adrenaline screaming through her system. Anvil, my status is I'm about to make your day a lot better. Stand by. She pickled off 6 rockets in 2 seconds, watched them streak down toward the northeast ridgeline trailing white smoke. They impacted in a rolling sequence of orange fireballs that walked across the enemy positions like the fingers of an angry god. The machine gun fire stopped abruptly. Nix counted to 3, giving the smoke time to clear, then rolled in for another gun run. This time she came in from the west, using the sun behind her to blind anyone trying to aim. The GAU-8 spoke again, shorter bursts this time, conserving ammunition, still devastating. When she pulled off target, her fuel gauge showed 2,000 pounds, enough to get back to Bagram if she flew straight and didn't hit any headwinds. Not enough if she had to fight her way out. Anvil 2-6, Reaper 7-1 is Winchester on effective ordnance. Northeast sector is neutralized. You've got maybe 3 minutes before they regroup. Move now. The response came back immediately, the SEAL commander's voice rough with emotion he wasn't quite hiding anymore. Reaper, Anvil 2-6 copies all. We're moving. You just saved 6 lives. We won't forget this. Nix turned southeast, toward Bagram, nursing her crippled A-10 across the mountains. The cockpit smelled like burnt electronics and hydraulic fluid. Her left hand was cramping from holding the stick with constant right pressure to compensate for the dead engine. She was cold, exhausted, and running on fumes both literally and figuratively. Behind her, the valley was falling into darkness. Ahead, the lights of Bagram were still 60 miles away. She focused on the fundamentals: airspeed, altitude, heading. The things you could control when everything else was trying to kill you. The controller's voice crackled in her headset, calmer now, respectful in a way it hadn't been before. Reaper 7-1, Havoc, Maine. Be advised, Apache Flight reports enemy forces withdrawing from the valley. Anvil 2-6 has reached the extraction point. Quick Reaction Force is inbound for pickup. Mission success. Good work up there. Nix didn't respond immediately. She was watching her fuel gauge tick down, doing the math, wondering if she'd cut it too close this time. When she finally keyed the mic, her voice was as level as it had been when she first called in 3 minutes out, a lifetime ago. Havoc, Maine, Reaper 7-1 copies, requesting priority landing, single engine, low fuel state. I'd like to put this bird down before it decides to quit on me. The tower cleared her straight in. No pattern work, no delays. She flew the approach by the book, gear down early, flaps set, speed nailed at exactly 130 knots. The runway lights stretched out in front of her like a promise. When the wheels touched concrete, when she felt that solid thump of connection with the earth, something unclenched in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. She taxied clear and shut down the remaining engine. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft immediately, already cataloging the damage. There was a hole in her left engine nacelle big enough to put a fist through, shrapnel damage along the wing root, hydraulic fluid dripping onto the tarmac. One of the maintainers, a staff sergeant with 20 years in, looked up at her as she climbed down from the cockpit. "Ma'am, you flew this thing back on one engine with your hydraulics shot to hell." Nix pulled off her helmet. Her hair was matted with sweat. She was shaking just slightly, the adrenaline finally catching up with her now that the flying was done. She looked at the damaged aircraft, then back at the maintainer. "Sergeant, I've landed worse." He shook his head slowly, something like awe in his expression. "Yes, ma'am, I believe you have." The debriefing happened at 0:30 in a windowless room that smelled like bad coffee and printer toner. Nix sat across from her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Voss, who'd been trying to figure out how to handle her for the better part of 2 years. He was a good officer, competent by the book, the kind of leader who excelled at managing resources and maintaining readiness rates. He was also fundamentally uncomfortable with pilots who treated flight plans like suggestions and minimum safe distances like interesting starting points for negotiation. Voss tapped his pen against the mission report. "Captain Abalos, you launched without authorization, flew into a denied combat zone, conducted multiple gun runs inside the minimum safe distance from friendly forces, and returned with battle damage that's going to keep that aircraft down for a week. You have anything to say for yourself?" Nix met his gaze without flinching. She'd been through this dance before. "Sir, 6 SEALs are alive because I was willing to bend some rules. I'd make the same call again." Voss sighed. He'd known that would be her answer. It was always her answer. "The rules exist for a reason, Captain. They keep people alive. They keep order in a chaotic environment. When you ignore them, you set a precedent that undermines the entire command structure." Nix leaned forward slightly. Her voice was quiet but carried an edge that made Voss pay attention. "Sir, with respect, those SEALs didn't need order. They needed a pilot willing to fly into a hot zone when everyone else said it was impossible. That's what I do. That's what I've always done. And every time I do it, I get called reckless and dangerous and insubordinate. But the guys on the ground, the ones who are actually dying when the system says there's no help available, they don't think I'm reckless. They think I'm their last chance." Voss set down his pen. He looked tired. "I'm not denying what you accomplished tonight, Nix. The SEAL team commander has already put you in for a distinguished flying cross. The ground force commander wants you attached to his unit permanently. But I can't have pilots in my squadron who think they can freelance whenever they feel like it. I can't maintain operational readiness if everyone decides to interpret orders according to their personal code of honor." Nix nodded slowly. She understood what he was saying even if she didn't agree with it. "So what happens now, sir?" Voss picked up the mission report and dropped it in his desk drawer. "Now, I write you up for unauthorized mission deviation and operational risk-taking. It goes in your jacket. And then tomorrow, when the wing commander asks why you aren't getting promoted ahead of your peers, I'll have documentation to explain it." Nix stood. She wasn't angry. She'd known the cost of flying the way she did. Promotions, career advancement, the approval of officers who valued predictability over results. She traded all of that for something simpler, the knowledge that when Americans were dying and the system had failed them, she'd be the one flying through the fire to bring them home. Understood, sir. Is that all? Voss looked at her for a long moment. One more thing, off the record. Nix waited. Voss's expression softened just slightly. I had a son, Marine Corps infantry. He was killed in Helmand Province 3 years ago. His unit was pinned down, taking casualties, waiting for air support that never came because the weather was too bad and the risk was too high. I think about that a lot. I think about whether there was someone out there who could have saved him if they'd been willing to break the rules. He paused, something raw and painful in his eyes. I don't know if I'm right to try and rein you in, Captain. I just know that if I don't, someone's going to get hurt. Maybe you, maybe someone you're trying to save. And I'll have to write that letter to their family explaining why I let a pilot operate outside the lines. Nix felt something shift in her understanding of Voss. He wasn't just a bureaucrat protecting his career. He was a father trying to make sense of a system that had failed his son. I'm sorry about your son, sir. But I can't promise to fly differently. Those SEALs tonight, they're someone's sons too. If I'd waited for authorization, if I'd followed the rules, they'd be dead right now. I have to live with that math. Voss nodded. I know, dismissed, Captain. Nix saluted and left the office. Outside, the sky was turning gray with the approach of dawn. She walked across the flight line, past the rows of aircraft, until she reached her damaged A-10. The maintainers had already pulled panels off the left engine, exposing the shredded turbine blades. She touched the fuselage, feeling the cold metal under her palm. This aircraft had kept her alive through 3 combat tours, absorbed damage that should have killed her a dozen times and always brought her home. Tomorrow it would be in the hangar being rebuilt, and she would be in the briefing room preparing for the next mission. Because that's what you did. You flew, you fought, you saved who you could. And you lived with the consequences. Word spread fast in the tight community of forward-deployed air support crews. By noon the next day, every pilot, controller, and ground force commander at Bagram knew the story. Captain Nix Abalos had gone into the valley that 8 helicopters, threaded a gun run through enemy fire at 50 feet off the deck, taken battle damage, and brought 6 SEALs home alive. The details got embellished in the retelling, the way combat stories always do, but the core facts remained undeniable. She'd done something nobody else would attempt, and she'd made it look routine. In the chow hall, a group of Army Rangers who'd worked with Nix on a previous mission raised their coffee cups when she walked past. In the operations center, the controller who'd tried to warn her off the mission asked if she'd be available for a close air support tasking in Paktika province, where the terrain was even worse than Kunar. The SEAL team sent a case of beer to her squadron with a note that simply read, "To Reaper 7-1. You earned it." But there were other reactions too, quieter and less generous. In the squadron briefing room, a captain with half her flight hours and twice her career prospects made a pointed comment about cowboys who made the rest of them look bad. A major from wing operations wondered aloud whether setting the precedent of unauthorized launches might encourage less experienced pilots to take risks they couldn't handle. And her squadron commander, caught between his duty to maintain order and his recognition of what she'd accomplished, said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than criticism. Nix ignored most of it. She'd learned early in her career that the Air Force was fundamentally uncomfortable with pilots who operated at the edges of doctrine. There was a place in military aviation for people like her. Someone had to be willing to do the impossible, but there was no career path for them, no promotion board that valued tactical audacity over procedural compliance. She'd made peace with that. What bothered her more were the letters. 3 of them arrived within a week, forwarded through official channels. 2 were from SEAL team members who'd been in the valley, writing to thank her in words that didn't quite capture what they were feeling but tried anyway. The 3rd was from the wife of the SEAL commander, a woman Nix had never met, whose husband had apparently spent an entire phone call home describing the A-10 pilot who'd saved his life. The letter was simple and direct. It said, "My children have a father because of you. I don't know what else to say except thank you, and please be careful, because there are people you haven't met yet who need you to come home too." Nix kept that letter in her flight suit pocket. The next mission came 3 days later. A Marine Corps convoy ambushed in Helmand province. 4 vehicles disabled, casualties mounting. The Taliban had learned to attack during the narrow window between when one air support package went off station and before the next one arrived. They were getting smarter, more patient, more willing to trade time for American blood. Nix was on alert duty when the call came in. She was in the cockpit and taxiing before the tower had finished reading her clearance. The operations center tried to wave her off. There was an F-16 flight closer, they said, better suited for precision strikes in complex terrain. Nix ignored them. She knew what F-16s could do, and it was impressive, but it wasn't what those Marines needed. They needed someone willing to fly low and slow through small arms fire, someone who could put ordnance on target when the enemy was 20 meters from friendlies, someone whose aircraft was built to absorb punishment and keep fighting. They needed a warthog, and they needed her. The mission went almost identically to the SEAL rescue. She arrived before anyone expected her. She made gun runs that violated every safety protocol in the tactical manual. She took damage, this time a hit to her right aileron that made the aircraft want to roll left constantly, and she flew it home anyway. The Marines wrote letters. The squadron commander wrote her up. The cycle continued. By the end of her deployment, Nix had flown 43 combat sorties, been hit by enemy fire 7 times, and accumulated enough documentation of rules violations to probably end her career if anyone at the Pentagon ever bothered to read her jacket file carefully. She'd also been put in for 3 more medals, had standing requests from 2 Army Brigade combat teams and a Marine Expeditionary Unit to be permanently attached to their operations, and had developed a reputation that made new pilots either worship her or think she was going to get them all killed. The truth was somewhere in between. She wasn't reckless. She was precise. Every risk she took was calculated. Every rule she broke was weighed against the lives at stake. She knew her aircraft's capabilities better than the engineers who designed it. She knew the terrain better than the people who lived there. And she knew with absolute certainty that when she heard Americans dying on the radio and everyone else was saying it was impossible to help them, she would find a way. That certainty came at a cost. It wore on her body, the G-forces, the stress, the missions that pushed her past the edge of exhaustion. It wore on her relationships. She had none, really, outside the tight circle of people who'd been under her guns. And it wore on her soul in ways she didn't talk about with the flight surgeons who asked probing questions about stress and coping mechanisms. Because the truth was, every time she saved 6 people in one valley, she thought about all the other valleys where she hadn't been, all the missions that happened before she arrived, all the calls for help that went unanswered because the system said no one could get there in time. She carried those ghosts with her, invisible passengers in her cockpit, reminders that being good at this job meant living with the knowledge that you could never be good enough. After she rotated back to the States, after the medals were pinned on and the debrief sessions were finished, and the squadron threw her a party she didn't want, Nix took 30 days of leave and drove across the country without a destination. He stayed in cheap motels and ate at diners and tried to remember what it felt like to be a person instead of a call sign. Somewhere in Montana, in a bar that smelled like sawdust and beer, a man with a weathered face and a Marine Corps tattoo bought her a drink. He didn't ask what she did. He just said, "You've got the look, like you've been carrying something heavy for too long." Nix stared at her drink. "Something like that." The man nodded. "I was in Fallujah, second battle, saw things that stick with you." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "Someone told me once that the weight doesn't get lighter, you just get stronger at carrying it. Don't know if that's true, but it got me through some dark days." Nix looked at him. "Did it work?" He smiled, sad and knowing. "I'm still here, aren't I? Still breathing, still trying. That's about all any of us can do." She finished her drink and thanked him. Outside, the Montana sky was impossibly wide and clear, filled with stars that looked nothing like the Afghan night but reminded her of it anyway. She thought about the SEAL team, about the Marines in Helmand, about all the people who were alive because she'd been willing to fly through fire. And she thought about the man in the bar, still breathing, still trying. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. She got back in her car and kept driving. The instructor position at Nellie's Air Force Base wasn't supposed to be a punishment, but Nix understood the subtext. Take the talented but problematic captain, put her somewhere she can't freelance, let her teach the next generation of pilots how to fly close air support the right way, which meant the safe way, the predictable way, the way that kept commanders happy and casualty rates acceptable and nobody's career in jeopardy. Nix accepted the assignment without complaint. She was tired. 3 combat deployments in 4 years had burned through her reserves of anger and righteousness. Maybe teaching would be easier. Maybe she could find some peace in passing on what she'd learned without having to carry the weight of life-and-death decisions every single day. The students were younger than she expected, bright-eyed and confident in the way people are before they've been shot at. They knew her reputation, of course. In the small world of A-10 pilots, everyone knew about Reaper 7-1, the captain who'd made a habit of saving people everyone else had given up on. Some of the students looked at her with awe. Others looked at her with skepticism, wondering if the stories were exaggerated, if she was really as good as people said. Nix didn't care either way. She taught them how to read terrain, how to coordinate with ground controllers, how to put ordnance on target with precision. She taught them about fuel management and battle damage assessment, and the 100 small skills that separated pilots who were merely competent from pilots who could operate in the worst conditions and still bring everyone home. What she didn't teach them was how to break rules. She didn't teach them how to launch unauthorized or how to fly closer to the ground than regulations allowed or how to decide when the mission mattered more than your career. Because she'd realized something during her leave, driving across empty highways under endless skis. What she did in Afghanistan worked because she'd spent years building the skills to make it work. She'd accumulated thousands of hours of experience, developed an instinctive understanding of her aircraft's capabilities, learned to read combat situations with a speed and accuracy that came from repetition and survival and luck. If she taught young pilots to fly the way she flew, some of them would die. They'd attempt the same maneuvers without the same preparation, take the same risks without the same judgment, and they'd auger into a mountainside or get shot down or kill the people they were trying to save. So she taught them the safe way, the right way, and she hated every minute of it. 6 months into her assignment, a former student crashed during a training exercise. He'd been attempting a low-altitude gun run in challenging terrain, trying to thread a shot through a narrow valley, and he'd misjudged his altitude. The A-10 impacted the ridgeline at 300 knots. The investigation ruled it pilot error, failure to maintain situational awareness, exactly the kind of accident that happened when someone pushed too hard without the skills to back it up. In the debrief, another instructor made a pointed comment about pilots who glorified dangerous flying and set unrealistic examples for impressionable students. Everyone in the room knew he was talking about Nix. She didn't defend herself. She went home to her empty apartment and sat in the dark and wondered if he was right. Maybe her presence was doing more harm than good. Maybe her reputation encouraged exactly the kind of recklessness that got people killed. Maybe the squadron commander back at Bagram had been right to try and rein her in, and she'd been too arrogant to see it. The guilt was different from what she'd felt in Afghanistan. There, she'd carried the weight of people she couldn't save, strangers dying in valleys she couldn't reach. Here, she carried the weight of a student who died trying to fly like her, trying to be the kind of pilot who could do impossible things. She'd shown him the destination without teaching him the journey. The next morning, she requested a transfer, back to combat operations, back to places where the rules were simpler and the stakes were clearer, and she could do what she was good at without worrying about what example she was setting. The request was denied. The Air Force had other plans for Captain Nix Abalos. They were standing up a new program, they said. Advanced close air support tactics for high-risk environments. They needed someone with operational experience to develop the curriculum, someone who understood both the capabilities and the limitations of aggressive tactical flying. They needed her to turn her instincts into doctrine, her experiences into lessons that could be taught systematically instead of learned through trial and error in combat. Nix read the orders twice. It was a promotion in everything but rank, more responsibility, more influence, and absolutely no flying. She would be behind a desk, writing manuals, teaching instructors who would teach students who would eventually fly the missions she couldn't fly anymore. It was a nightmare. It was also an opportunity. If she could figure out how to codify what she knew, if she could develop training that built the skills she'd acquired through years of dangerous flying, maybe she could create pilots who were capable of doing what she did without dying in the attempt. Maybe she could turn her tactical audacity into something the Air Force could replicate instead of just tolerate in one problematic captain. She accepted the assignment, and she got to work. The program took 2 years to develop. Nix interviewed every close air support pilot she could find who'd survived high-risk engagements. She studied accident reports, looking for patterns in what went wrong. She built simulation scenarios that pushed students to their limits without killing them. And she wrote doctrine that balanced aggression with judgment, that acknowledged there were times when breaking rules was necessary, but taught pilots how to know when those times had arrived. The work was tedious, bureaucratic, nothing like the visceral satisfaction of putting steel on target and hearing grateful voices on the radio. But it mattered. She could feel it mattering in ways that individual missions never quite did. Every pilot who graduated from her program would carry pieces of her knowledge into future fights. Every ground unit that benefited from better trained close air support would be safer because she'd spent 2 years behind a desk instead of in a cockpit. The Air Force promoted her to major. She didn't care about the rank, but she cared about what it represented: legitimacy. The system was acknowledging that her approach to flying wasn't just reckless individualism, but a set of skills and judgments that could be integrated into institutional practice. She wasn't an outlier anymore. She was the foundation of a new standard. In the 3rd year of the program, Nix got a call from a number she didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was older, rougher, but she recognized it anyway. Anvil 26, the SEAL commander from the valley in Cunnar. Captain Abalos, sorry, Major Abalos now, I heard. This is Michael Torres. I don't know if you remember me. Nix set down the manual she'd been editing. I remember, Commander. How can I help you? Torres paused, and she heard something in that pause that made her pay attention. I wanted you to know something. My son just graduated from college. Full ride on an ROTC scholarship. He's joining the Air Force, wants to fly A-10s, says he wants to be like the pilot who saved his dad. Nix felt something catch in her throat. She'd never thought about the SEALs having families, having children, having lives that extended beyond that desperate day in the valley. I'm honored, Commander. I hope he makes it. Torres laughed, warm and genuine. He will. Kid's got talent, but more than that, he's got purpose. He knows what it means to show up when people have given up hope. You taught him that without ever meeting him. After they hung up, Nix sat for a long time, staring at the manual in front of her. She'd spent years wondering if what she did mattered, if the risks she took and the rules she broke added up to something more than individual moments of violence and salvation. Now she knew. It wasn't just about the people she saved. It was about the example she set, the proof that impossible things could be done if you were willing to pay the price. Tor's son would fly missions she'd never hear about, would save people she'd never meet, and some of them would have sons and daughters who'd carry the ripple forward into a future she wouldn't live to see. That was legacy, not medals or promotions or official recognition. Legacy was the invisible network of saved lives spreading out through time, each one a node in a web of possibility that existed only because she'd been willing to fly through fire when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The program launched the next year. The first class of students graduated with honors. 3 of them deployed to Syria within 6 months and immediately started putting Nix's doctrine into practice, flying missions that previous generations of pilots would have considered suicidal and bringing everyone home. The reports came back glowing. The tactics worked. The training worked. The careful balance between aggression and judgment that Nix had spent 2 years trying to articulate in manuals and briefings was translating into combat effectiveness. Ground commanders started requesting pilots from her program specifically. The Air Force started expanding the training, rolling it out to other squadrons, other bases. What had started as one captain's refusal to accept limitations was becoming standard practice. Nix got orders for her fourth combat deployment. Not as a pilot this time. She was too senior now, too valuable as a program manager, but as an advisor, embedded with a forward air control team in Iraq. Her job was to observe how her doctrine was being implemented in real combat conditions and refine the training based on what she learned. She was back in the war, but at a distance now, watching other pilots do what she used to do. It should have felt wrong. It should have felt like being benched, sidelined, turned into a spectator at the game she'd once played better than anyone. But it didn't. It felt like completion. She'd gone from being the person who flew the missions to being the person who ensured the missions could be flown. From tactical executor to strategic architect. It wasn't the career she'd imagined when she first put on a flight suit, but it was the career she'd earned. And somewhere in a valley in Afghanistan, or a desert in Iraq, or a mountain range she'd never heard of, there were Americans who would come home because she'd taught someone how to fly through fire. That was enough. The firebase in northern Iraq was smaller than Bagram, more austere, closer to the fighting. Nix spent her days in the Tactical Operations Center, watching drone feeds and listening to radio communications as her former students conducted close air support missions in terrain that made Kunar province look gentle. The enemy here had learned from Afghanistan, adapted their tactics, developed new ways to exploit the seams in American doctrine. But the pilots had adapted too. They flew with a confidence and precision that came from training that actually prepared them for the worst-case scenarios instead of just hoping those scenarios wouldn't happen. During one mission, Nix watched a young captain barely 26, fresh from her program, execute a gun run that made her catch her breath. The tactical situation was nearly identical to the SEAL rescue that had defined her reputation. Friendlies pinned down, enemy on high ground. Narrow valley, impossible geometry. The young captain came in low, threaded the needle, put rounds exactly where they needed to be, and pulled off target without taking a scratch. Textbook execution of doctrine that hadn't existed 3 years ago. The ground controller's voice came over the speaker, breathless with relief. Hawk 2-3, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. You just saved 8 lives. The young captain